As crime levels continue to escalate in the country, many citizens feel that they have the right to protect themselves by owning weapons. At the same time, the government feels that there are too many guns floating around, and with many robberies occurring at homes, guns are bound to fall into the wrong hands. Now, some gun organizations believe that we must have a gun-free society or gun-safe society, and others feel that citizens have the right to own firearms to protect themselves. Now, does owning a gun make it easier for the weapons to fall into the wrong hands, or does not owning a firearm make you more vulnerable to criminals? To talk more on the issue, we're joined by Paul Oxley from Gun Owners South Africa. Paul, thanks so much for your time. Let's just look at the current Firearms Control Act.
Yes.
And how effective it is.
In terms of what? The current Firearms Control Act?
Yes, in terms of ownership, access to weapons as well. Does it just allow for more guns to be on our streets?
The current Firearms Control Act, although it was the legislation was introduced in 2000, it was promulgated in 2004, hasn't yet fully come into effect. So it's difficult to say what the results will be. The problems with the Firearms Control Act are manifold, and we've been dealing with a number of them this year in the courts. The government has been beaten down quite badly both times it's been taken to court this year, once by South African hunters and once by Gun Owners of South Africa using the Justice Alliance to take the fight to the courts for us. In both instances they've been severely beaten. I was privileged to be on the show a couple of months ago, as you may recall, and at that stage I said it's not about the guns, it's about the Constitution. And that's exactly where we stand. We have, the Firearms Control Act is a bad piece of legislation. It always has been, always was. And it's been cobbled together in a fashion that rides roughshod over the South African Constitution at every step. We have a number of other constitutional challenges which we are busy preparing at this stage. It doesn't deal at all with illegal firearms, with firearms in criminal hands. It seeks to try to control firearms in licensed firearm owners' hands, which aren't the problem. Now, you can't address a problem by not dealing with the problem.
Because more often than not, when we hear about criminal activity, it has to do with heavy machinery, AK-47s, R5s, and I imagine that not a lot of citizens would have that in their possession.
Quite, and those that do have are extremely highly regulated and very well trained and very well equipped to secure those firearms. Just before the weekend, I think in Parliament, the government was forced to admit that something like 147 R5s had gone missing, assault rifles had gone missing from the various police stations this year only. And that's frightening. That's a company and a half of infantry soldiers that are on the streets armed by the South African police services. So when the President says, with great respect to the President in his position, when he says that there are too many firearms floating around and being stolen from licensed owners, even from the police, he says, he shouldn't be saying even from the police, he should be saying specifically from the police. This is just the assault rifles that they've lost this year that they're admitting to. Now, we all know how accurate the police statistics are and how closely they adhere to the law. We don't need to mention dockets that go missing and etc. etc.
All right, but why the focus though on licensed firearms?
Because we're easy targets. Because licensed firearm owners are the single most easily identifiable law-abiding target in the country. Licensed firearm owners, by virtue of the fact that they're licensed, are law-abiding. They are not the people who are going to break the law, but they're also the people who are easiest to find because they're all registered. They all live in fixed abodes because those are the requirements of firearm licensing. So they're easy to target. And they can be relied upon to provide the firearms to the police, and the police say, give us your firearms.
Yeah, but you also cannot abdicate responsibility because there has been firearms that have been lost at the hands of licensed firearm owners. There has been criminality also in part, be it in the home or...
The South African police services themselves admit that the incidence of crime amongst licensed firearm owners using those firearms in commission of that crime is so negligible that is statistically insignificant. But yes, of course, you're going to have odd occurrences. Stuff happens. People, for whatever reason, go off the rails. Somebody may have slipped through a licensing process before by bribing the police. by buying their licenses. This happens. You know, you can't avoid that. I mean, it'd be unrealistic to imagine that you could have a perfect system. Perfect systems don't exist when humans are involved. They never do.
But just making society, our neighborhoods, our homes more safer,
Yes.
Especially with safe gun use,
Yes.
and especially if criminals are aware that certain households may have firearms, that in itself perpetuates the problem. I mean, where then
Not really.
is the
if you
result?
look at South Africa has a paucity of decent statistical analysis on the subject. We know not many subjects, or not many of these subjects have been researched adequately in South Africa. So for those kind of answers, we have to look to overseas sources where there has been studies published and been financed, because studies are expensive. And if we look at the United States, where studies by the Institute of Justice in the United States, by the FBI, by the government institutions, reveal that firearms, the knowledge that firearms are in a house is more likely to prevent crime happening in that house than anything else. There have been a couple of in the United States which are held up as particularly in the United States, which are held up as case studies. One in which there was a terrific rape problem in one particular area. The police went out of their way to train women in firearms handling, and was well publicized. Rape statistics plummeted, because no rapist wants to find himself staring down the barrel of a gun. Rape almost ceased in that area. Even after and this is not saying that women were actually armed, but there was a greater likelihood, from the rapist's perspective, that he might come across an armed victim.
Yeah.
Rape statistics plummeted.
But I mean,
years after the fact, rape statistics were still the lowest in the United States.
Yeah, but surely you should engage government as opposed to fighting it off in the courts, whether the license issue is unfair or biased.
If only the government was prepared to engage honestly with its citizens. Unfortunately, they're not. When they powered this act through, it was against the largest civil a demonstration of support opposed to provisions of the Act that's ever been seen in South Africa. Petitions were delivered to Parliament in wheelbarrows down the streets in Cape Town. It had absolutely no effect. They ignored all of the recommendations that were made to them. And ever since then, they've had this. This is another one of the constitutional challenges, by the way, is the Constitution requires that legislation be introduced in a consultative manner. The government has never engaged in a fair consultation with those parties most affected. In other words, with the firearm owners. And remember that the firearm owners, since our new dispensation, are now pretty neatly cut down the center between the different population groups. So we're not talking about a group that's being isolated. The group that's being isolated and marginalized is gun owners. For some reason, they have become a special breed of victim.
All right, so what happens next? Because you're waiting now for your 90 days for the compensation, especially with firearms that weren't...
We imagine that what's going to happen is that the government is going to try to put a stop to the courts and say, right, well, oops, we made a mistake. They can't say, by the way, that it was an honest mistake, because it was an illegal and unconstitutional error right from the beginning. They knew this, and it was confirmed by Judge President Jeanette Traverse in her judgment. She said this was illegal and it was unconstitutional. What they're probably going to try to do is say, okay, well, we don't know how to value these firearms. Now, what we'll do is we'll give everybody that had it in a firearm, and this is almost 1 million people, mind, we'll give them 100 Rand compensation. Unfortunately, the Constitution is against them on that too. The Constitution determines that compensation shall be payable on 3 legs. The value of the firearm, of the property, which is forfeit to the state, the utility of that product, and the use and the history of use of that product. So if a person, for argument's sake, and just quickly, if a person has utilized his firearm to ward off a home invasion, he can fairly claim that the value of that firearm is equivalent to the value of his and his family's lives.
And you can't quantify that. All right, Paul, we're running late for news, but thanks so much always for engaging us. Thanks so much.
It's a great pleasure.
We're speaking to Paul Oxley from Gun Owners South Africa, and you can share your views with us in terms of having a gun-safe society. That's Sunrise at etv.co.za. We're back with the latest news just after this.